Lin Mei sat quietly in the back row of the gleaming concert hall, admiring how the afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows and danced across the polished wood floor. The prestigious Eastern City Conservatory of Music always made her feel small somehow. Its grand architecture and rich history, a constant reminder of a world she had only briefly touched in her youth. She smoothed the wrinkles from her simple blue dress, feeling out of place among the well-dressed musicians and academics who filled the room for the faculty meeting. Her husband, Professor Zhang, stood near the front, deep in conversation with the conservatory's director and several other distinguished music teachers. Lin smiled to herself, proud of how respected he had become since joining the faculty 3 years ago. As a physics professor who specialized in acoustics, Zhang had been invited to collaborate with the music department on an innovative research project. Though she rarely attended these gatherings, today was special. The meeting would be followed by a small reception celebrating the conservatory's upcoming centennial. "And who might you be?" asked a voice beside her. Lin turned to find an older woman with perfectly styled silver hair and an expensive-looking silk scarf draped around her neck. "I'm Lin Mei," she replied with a polite smile. "Professor Zhang's wife." The woman's eyebrows rose slightly. "Ah, the physicist. How interesting. I'm Professor Wang, head of the piano department." She gestured toward where Lin's husband stood. "Are you a musician as well?" Lin felt her cheeks warm. "Oh no, nothing like that. I mean, I played piano as a girl, but that was many years ago. Just for fun." Something in Professor Wang's expression shifted, a subtle tightening around her mouth, a dismissive glance. That made Lin wish she hadn't mentioned playing at all. "How charming," Professor Wang said, in a tone that suggested it was anything but. "So many people dabble, don't they?" Before Lin could respond, her husband appeared at her side. "Lin, there you are. I've been telling everyone about your wonderful cooking. The director has invited us both to the faculty dinner next month." Professor Wang's smile turned razor-thin. "Your wife was just telling me she used to play piano, Zhang. A hobbyist, I gather." "Lin is being modest," Zhang said, putting his arm around her shoulders. "She has a beautiful touch. When I'm grading papers late at night, she sometimes plays our old upright, and it's the highlight of my day." Lin wanted to disappear into the floor. She could see other faculty members drifting toward their conversation. Curiosity piqued. "Is that so?" said a tall man with a closely trimmed beard and intense eyes. "What sort of pieces do you play, Mrs. Zhang?" "Just simple things," Lin said quietly. "Folk songs, some easy classical pieces I remember from childhood. Lin had a wonderful teacher when she was young," Zhang continued, seemingly oblivious to her discomfort. "But her family couldn't afford lessons after she turned 12. The bearded man exchanged glances with Professor Wang. "How unfortunate," he said, though his tone suggested he found it merely predictable. "I'm Professor Chen," he said, extending his hand. "I teach advanced piano performance." Small crowd had gathered now. 5 or 6 professors, forming a half-circle around Lin. She recognized some of them from photographs on the conservatory website and concert programs Zhang had brought home. "We were just discussing the faculty showcase for the centennial," said Professor Wang, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Perhaps Mrs. Zhang would like to participate." Lin's heart skipped a beat. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly. Oh, what a splendid idea." Zhang interrupted, squeezing her shoulder. Lin would love to be part of the celebration. The circle of professors exchanged glances that Lin couldn't quite interpret. Were they amused, annoyed? The bearded Professor Chen stroked his chin thoughtfully. "The showcase is meant to demonstrate the conservatory's excellence," he said. "All performers will be expected to present pieces of significant technical difficulty." "Of course," Zhang nodded enthusiastically. "Lin understands that." Lin wanted to protest, to explain that she played simple melodies on an out-of-tune piano in their apartment, that she had never performed in public, that this was a terrible mistake. But the words caught in her throat as she saw the subtle challenge in Professor Wang's eyes. "What piece would you suggest for an amateur of Mrs. Zhang's background?" Professor Wang asked, addressing her colleagues while barely glancing at Lin. A younger woman with sharp features and a sleek ponytail spoke up. "Perhaps Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3? It would complement my Tchaikovsky selection nicely." Lin felt the blood drain from her face. Even she knew of Rachmaninoff's Third. It was infamous for its difficulty. a mountain that even professional pianists approached with caution. She had once watched a documentary where they called it the Everest of piano concertos. That's perhaps a bit ambitious, Zhang began, finally sensing the trap, but Professor Chen cut him off. No, I think Professor Liu has made an excellent suggestion. The H3 would be perfect. His eyes locked with Lin's. Unless Mrs. Zhang feels it's beyond her capabilities, the challenge hung in the air. Lin felt every eye upon her, measuring her, judging her already. These people, with their expensive clothes and lifetime of training, had already decided who she was. A simple housewife pretending to belong in their world. Something stirred within her, a flicker of pride, of defiance. I would be honored to attempt Rachmaninoff, she said quietly, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Professor Wang's eyebrows shot up. Wonderful. It settled then. The showcase is in 8 weeks. I'll have the music department send you the score and details. She turned away, already engaged in conversation with another colleague, as if Lin had ceased to exist. As the group dispersed, Lin stood frozen, the enormity of what had just happened washing over her. Zhang leaned close, his face a mask of concern. Lin, I'm so sorry. I got carried away. You don't have to do this. She looked up at her husband, seeing the regret in his eyes. They set me up to fail, she whispered. We'll tell them you've changed your mind. They were being cruel and I was too slow to see it. Lin glanced across the room where Professor Wang was laughing with several colleagues, occasionally throwing glances in their direction. 8 weeks to learn what many considered the most technically challenging piano concerto ever written. It was impossible. She would humiliate herself and embarrass Zhang. Let's go home, she said softly. The ride back to their apartment was quiet. Lin stared out the window at the city passing by, her mind racing. Images from her childhood flashed through her memory. Her old teacher, Mr. Huang, telling her she had a gift. Her mother apologizing with tears in her eyes when they could no longer afford lessons. The ache she felt when they sold her small upright piano to pay for her brother's school fees. By the time they reached their apartment building, something had shifted inside her. As they climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, Lin turned to Zhang. I want to try, she said. Zhang stopped on the landing. What? The Rachmaninoff. I want to try. Lin, be reasonable. Those people have studied their entire lives. They were just trying to embarrass you, embarrass us. She nodded. I know, and maybe I will fail. Probably I will fail, but I want to try anyway. Zhang studied her face, confusion giving way to understanding. You're serious. I need to use the practice rooms at the conservatory. Can you arrange it? A slow smile spread across her husband's face. Of course I can. But Lin, where is this coming from? She thought about Professor Wang's dismissive glance, about the years of setting aside her own dreams to support her family, about the music that still lived inside her despite everything. I don't know if I can play Rachmaninoff, she said, but I need to find out. That night after dinner, Lin searched online for recordings of the Piano Concerto No. 3. As the first thunderous notes poured from their small laptop speakers, her heart sank. The piece was even more formidable than she had feared, a relentless torrent of notes that seemed to require not just 2 hands, but 20 fingers. Lin closed her eyes and listened, really listened, letting the music wash over her. Beneath its fearsome technical demands, she began to hear something else, a story of struggle, of longing, of hope pushing through darkness. Her fingers twitched in her lap, already trying to find those opening notes. When the recording ended, she opened her eyes to find Zhang watching her from the doorway. I called the facilities manager at the conservatory, he said. You can use practice room 7 starting tomorrow. Early mornings and evenings when the students aren't there. Lin nodded, her throat tight with emotion. The custodian will let you in. His name is Old Wu. He's worked there for 30 years. She smiled at her husband, gratitude and fear battling within her. Thank you. Later, lying awake in bed while Zhang slept beside her, Lin stared at the ceiling, listening to Rachmaninoff in her mind. 8 weeks? Impossible. Yet something inside her refused to give up before she'd even begun. Tomorrow she would sit at a real piano again, not their cheap electric keyboard, but one of the conservatory's grand pianos. Tomorrow she would place her hands on the keys and begin the impossible climb. And maybe, just maybe, she would discover what her old teacher had seen in her all those years ago, something those elite professors, with all their knowledge and accomplishments, had failed to recognize at first glance. The conservatory stood quiet in the early morning light as Lynn approached the imposing building. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the printed score of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 that Zhang had downloaded and bound for her. The pages felt heavy in her hands, weighted with impossible expectations. She paused at the bottom of the stone steps, suddenly doubtful. What was she thinking? She hadn't touched a proper piano in years, and now she planned to tackle one of the most difficult pieces ever written. She almost turned back, almost gave in to the voice telling her she was making a fool of herself. Then she remembered Professor Wang's dismissive smile and her spine straightened. One day at a time, she told herself. Just try. As promised, an elderly man was waiting by the side entrance. He had weathered hands and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "Mrs. Zhang?" he asked, his voice gravelly but gentle. Lynn nodded, clutching her music tighter. "I'm Wu," he said, unlocking the door. "Been keeping this place clean for more than half my life. Your husband arranged for you to use practice room 7. Lynn followed him through silent hallways lined with photographs of famous musicians who had performed at the conservatory over the decades. Some faces she recognized, legendary pianists, conductors, composers. Others were unknown to her, but all had the same confident gaze, the same assurance of belonging in these hallowed halls. Wu led her to a small room at the end of a corridor. Inside was a single grand piano, its polished black surface gleaming in the morning light that streamed through a tall window. "This one's got the best sound," Wu said, patting the piano like an old friend. "Not the newest, but she sings like no other." He gestured to a small electric kettle in the corner. "Made you some tea. First day's always the hardest." Lynn was touched by the unexpected kindness. "Thank you, Mr. Wu." "Just Wu," he corrected with a smile. "I'll be around if you need anything. Take your time getting acquainted with her." He nodded toward the piano before slipping out, closing the door softly behind him. Alone now, Lynn approached the instrument with reverence. She set her music on the stand and carefully lifted the cover to reveal the keys, perfect white and black rectangles waiting patiently for her touch. She sat on the bench, adjusting it slightly, and placed her hands in her lap, suddenly afraid. What if she couldn't play at all anymore? What if her fingers had forgotten everything? Taking a deep breath, Lynn placed her hands on the keys and began with the simplest thing she could remember, a C major scale. Her fingers moved up and down, awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence. The notes rang clear and true in the small room. She tried a G major scale next, then a simple melody she'd played as a child. Memory stirred in her muscles, her fingers remembering what her mind had nearly forgotten. She began to play a folk song her mother used to sing, the notes flowing more naturally now. For nearly an hour, she reacquainted herself with the keyboard, avoiding looking at the intimidating Rachmaninoff score that waited for her. Finally, she could delay no longer. Lynn opened the music to the first page and studied the notes. The concerto began with a deceptively simple melody, a series of repeated notes that quickly blossomed into complex patterns. She placed her fingers on the keys and attempted the opening phrase. Her first try was halting, uncertain. She tried again and again, gradually finding the rhythm. By the end of the second hour, she could play the first few measures with some semblance of confidence, though still far too slowly. A soft knock interrupted her practice. Wu appeared with a fresh cup of tea. "How's it going?" he asked, setting the cup on a small table near the piano. Lynn shook her head, frustration evident in her face. "I'm barely through the first page." Wu glanced at the music on the stand and raised his eyebrows. "Rage 3? That's quite a mountain to climb. You know it?" Lynn asked, surprised. A hint of amusement crossed Wu's weathered face. "I've been listening to pianists practice in these rooms for 30 years. I know most of the great works by heart now." He tapped his temple. "Can't play a note myself, but up here I've performed them all perfectly." Lynn smiled despite her frustration. "I think I was crazy to agree to this. The showcase is in 8 weeks, and this piece takes professionals months to master." Wu studied her for a moment. "Why did you say yes?" The question caught her off guard. I'm not sure. Perhaps I was too proud to admit I couldn't do it." She stared down at her hands. "Or maybe I wanted to prove something to myself." Wu nodded thoughtfully. "Either way, you're here now. Might as well make the most of it." He pointed to the sheet music. "That first movement, it's telling a story. What do you think it's saying?" Lynn considered this. She closed her eyes and recalled the recording she'd listened to. It feels like someone setting out on a journey. Uncertain at first, then gathering courage. Not bad, Wu said with approval. Now try playing it that way, not just the notes, but the story. Lynn turned back to the piano and began again, thinking of her own journey as her fingers found the keys. Somehow the notes flowed more naturally this time. Wu listened, head tilted slightly. When she finished the passage, he nodded. Better. You have a natural sense for the phrasing. That's rare, you know. Many students here can play all the right notes but never tell the story. For the next several days, Lynn arrived at the conservatory at dawn and practiced until it was time to go home and prepare dinner. Wu often brought her tea and occasionally stopped to listen, offering simple observations that somehow transformed her playing. One morning during her second week, Lynn arrived to find a slim book on the piano bench. Exercises for Piano Technique, read the title. Inside the front cover was a note in neat handwriting. These might help. Well, the exercises were basic but effective, designed to build finger strength and independence. Lynn added them to her daily practice, gradually noticing improvement in her control over difficult passages. As the third week began, Lynn had worked her way through the first movement but still struggled with its technical demands. The second movement loomed ahead like an unconquerable peak. Her progress seemed painfully slow, and doubt began to creep back in. One evening, as she was packing up to leave, the door opened. Lynn looked up, expecting Wu, but instead found Professor Chen standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Zhang," he said with a curt nod. "I was told you've been using this room." Lynn's heart raced. "Yes, my husband arranged it. I hope that's not a problem." Professor Chen's eyes drifted to the Rachmaninoff score on the piano. "How is your preparation coming along?" "Slowly," Lynn admitted, fighting the urge to apologize for her presence in his domain. "I heard you playing as I passed by." His face remained impassive. "The arpeggios in the development section need work. Your left hand is dragging." Before Lynn could respond, he turned and left, closing the door firmly behind him. She sat frozen for a moment, then slowly gathered her things, a strange mix of embarrassment and determination washing over her. Professor Chen had been listening to her play. He hadn't mocked her outright or told her to give up. Instead, he'd offered criticism, real criticism, as if she were a student worth correcting. The next morning, Lynn attacked the arpeggios with renewed focus, working until her left hand ached but gradually bringing it into alignment with her right. By the end of the fourth week, she could play through the entire first movement without stopping, though still far from the tempo marked in the score. It was during the fifth week that everything nearly fell apart. Lynn had begun work on the second movement, a lyrical contrast to the thunderous first, when Wu entered with his customary tea. "You sound tired today," he observed. Setting down the cup, Lynn sighed, flexing her sore fingers. "I am tired. I practiced until midnight at home, then was back here at dawn." She looked up at him, finally voicing the fear that had been growing inside her. "What if I can't do this, Wu? What if I humiliate myself in front of the entire conservatory?" Wu sat down on a spare chair, considering her question. "Can I tell you something about this place?" he asked, gesturing to the walls around them. "I've watched thousands of students come through here, some with so much talent it would break your heart, others who worked twice as hard to achieve half as much." He leaned forward, his eyes serious. "But the ones who truly make music, the ones who move people when they play, they all have something that can't be taught. They have life in their playing. They've known joy and heartbreak and everything in between, and it comes through in every note." Wu pointed to the Rachmaninoff score. That piece wasn't written to be played perfectly. It was written to be felt deeply. Lynn considered his words, wondering what her own life experiences might bring to this music. She thought of her childhood dreams set aside, of the quiet pride she took in creating a home for Zhang, of the longing she still felt when she heard beautiful music. "Play it again," Wu encouraged. "But this time play your story, not Rachmaninoff's." Lynn turned back to the piano and began the second movement's haunting melody. This time she thought of her mother's face when they sold the family piano, of the way her heart still ached for the music she'd left behind. Her fingers found new expression in the notes, a quality that hadn't been there before. When she finished, Wu was smiling. "There," he said softly. "Now you're finding it." As Lynn gathered her things to leave that evening, She noticed the light on in another practice room. Through the small window in the door, she could see a young student hunched over a piano, practicing the same passage over and over, her face tight with concentration. Lynn watched for a moment, recognizing her own struggle in the girl's determined expression. Perhaps they were not so different after all, both climbing the same mountain, just starting from different points. With renewed purpose, Lynn headed home, the music of Rachmaninoff playing in her mind. There were still 3 weeks until the showcase, and she had mountains yet to climb. But for the first time, she began to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, she might find her way to the summit after all. The halfway point had come and gone. 4 weeks remained until the showcase, and Lynn's life had transformed around her daily practice routine. She woke at 5 each morning, practiced on their electric keyboard at home until 7, then traveled to the conservatory where she worked until mid-morning. After returning home to complete housework and prepare meals, she would practice again in the evening, her fingers dancing over silent keys late into the night while Zhang slept. Her body felt the toll of this new regimen. Her shoulders ached constantly, and she'd developed calluses on her fingertips. Sometimes she caught herself playing Rachmaninoff on tabletops and counters, her hands unable to rest even when away from the piano. "You're working too hard," Zhang told her one evening as he massaged her stiff shoulders. "Maybe you should take a day off." Lynn shook her head. "There's no time. I'm still struggling with the third movement and the cadenza." She sighed, thinking of the notorious solo passage near the end of the first movement that had become her personal nemesis. "At least eat something," Zhang urged, placing a bowl of soup beside her. "You've lost weight." Lynn smiled tiredly at her husband. "I'll eat, I promise." She picked up the spoon, realizing he was right. She had been skipping meals without noticing. "How are things at the conservatory? Have the professors mentioned the showcase?" Zhang hesitated. "They've been discussing it. Professor Wang asked if you were still planning to perform." Lynn's hand tightened around the spoon. "What did you tell her?" "That you practice every day and are determined to play." He paused. She seemed surprised. Lynn could imagine Professor Wang's reaction, probably the same dismissive smile, perhaps with a touch of annoyance that Lynn hadn't given up yet. She ate another spoonful of soup, drawing strength from the warm broth. Good. Let her be surprised. The next morning, Lynn arrived at the conservatory to find her usual practice room occupied. A note on the door read, "Room 7 closed for maintenance." Her heart sank. She had counted on those hours of practice. Wu appeared in the hallway, pushing his cleaning cart. "Good morning, Mrs. Zhang. Sorry about room 7, a pipe burst in the wall overnight. Is there another room I could use?" Lynn asked anxiously. Wu scratched his chin thoughtfully. "All the good rooms are booked for student practice today." He glanced around, then lowered his voice. "But the recital hall isn't being used until this afternoon. It's supposed to be off limits for practice, but..." He produced a key from his pocket and pressed it into her hand. "Third floor, end of the hall. Just be out by noon." Lynn's eyes widened. "The recital hall? Won't you get in trouble?" Wu shrugged. "What are they going to do, fire me? I've been here longer than most of the professors." He winked and continued down the hallway with his cart. Heart racing with a mix of excitement and trepidation, Lynn made her way to the 3rd floor. The recital hall was the conservatory's crown jewel, a perfectly acoustic space with tiered seating and a magnificent concert grand piano on the stage. She had only glimpsed it once before during a tour with Zhang. Using Wu's key, she unlocked the heavy doors and slipped inside. The hall was dark except for a few safety lights. Lynn found the switches and illuminated the stage, revealing the imposing Steinway grand piano at its center. She approached it reverently, almost afraid to touch such a fine instrument. This was the piano used for professional recordings and prestigious concerts. The showcase would be held here on this very stage, with this very piano. Lynn sat on the bench, adjusting it to her height, and placed her hands on the keys. The action was different from the practice room piano, more responsive, requiring a lighter touch. She began to play the opening of the Rachmaninoff concerto, and the notes seemed to float through the perfect acoustics of the hall, surrounding her with sound. For the first time, Lynn could truly hear herself as an audience would. The experience was both exhilarating and humbling. In this space, every hesitation, every uncertain phrase was magnified. But when she played with confidence, the music soared in a way she'd never heard before. She lost herself in practice, working through the difficult cadenza repeatedly, refining her interpretation of the lyrical second movement, battling the technical challenges of the third. In the empty hall, she could imagine an audience before her. Professor Wang with her skeptical gaze, Professor Chen with his critical ear, her husband with his unwavering support. Lin was so absorbed in her playing that she didn't notice the doors at the back of the hall opening, didn't see the figure who slipped into a seat in the shadows to listen. As noon approached, Lin gathered her music, reluctantly preparing to leave. A voice from the darkness startled her. "Your octaves in the third movement need work." Lin froze, peering into the dimly lit seating area. Professor Chen emerged from the shadows, walking down the center aisle toward the stage. "Professor Chen, I'm sorry, I know I shouldn't be in here." He waved away her apology. "I heard you from the hallway. Couldn't believe someone was playing in the recital hall." He climbed the steps to the stage. "Your tempo is still too cautious in the first movement, but the second—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "There's something interesting happening in your interpretation of the second movement." Lin wasn't sure if interesting was a compliment or criticism. "I'm still working on it," she said. Professor Chen nodded, his expression thoughtful. "The cadenza is where most pianists reveal their limitations with this piece. Play it for me." It wasn't a request but a command. Lin sat back down at the piano, her hands suddenly damp with nervous sweat. The cadenza was the most technically demanding passage in the first movement, a virtuosic solo that required not just technical prowess, but interpretive depth. She began to play, acutely aware of Professor Chen's critical ear. Her fingers stumbled over a particularly difficult passage and she winced, expecting him to stop her, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue to the end. When she finished, she waited anxiously for his verdict. "You're thinking too much," he said finally. "You're counting every note, analyzing every phrase. That's why you're stumbling." He moved to the piano and demonstrated a brief passage, his fingers flowing effortlessly over the keys. "See, the music needs to breathe. You're suffocating it with overthinking." Lin nodded, absorbing his criticism. "I'm afraid of making mistakes." "Of course you are," he said, his tone softer than she'd ever heard from him. "But fear is the enemy of music." He checked his watch. "I have a class. You should go. The afternoon rehearsal will be starting soon." As Lin gathered her things, Professor Chen paused at the stage steps. "Mrs. Zhang, why are you doing this?" The question caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" "This piece, this challenge. You must know the odds are against you." Lin considered her answer carefully. "At first, I think I wanted to prove something to Professor Wang, to all of you. That I wasn't just a housewife who dabbled in piano." Professor Chen waited for her to continue. But now, Lin looked at the magnificent piano, still resonating with the notes she had played. "Now I'm doing it for myself. For the girl who had to give up her music lessons. For the woman who never stopped hearing music in her head." She met his gaze steadily. "And yes, the odds are against me. But I've decided that doesn't matter anymore." Something shifted in Professor Chen's expression. Not quite approval, but perhaps a new understanding. He nodded once, then left without another word. That evening, Lin told Zhang about her unexpected encounter with Professor Chen. "He actually gave me advice," she said, still surprised by it. "Real advice, like I was a serious student." Zhang smiled. "Perhaps he's beginning to see what I've always seen in you." The following week brought new challenges. Lin's right wrist began to ache persistently, a sharp pain that worsened when she played certain passages. She tried to ignore it, pushing through the discomfort, but by the end of each practice session, the pain had become almost unbearable. "You should see a doctor," Wu told her when he noticed her rubbing her wrist. "Could be tendinitis. Common among pianists." "There's no time," Lin said, shaking her head. "The showcase is in 3 weeks," Wu frowned. "Won't be much of a showcase if you can't move your fingers." Reluctantly, Lin visited a clinic. The doctor confirmed Wu's suspicion, tendinitis from overuse, and recommended rest, anti-inflammatory medication, and a brace to wear when not playing. "You should avoid playing piano for at least 2 weeks," the doctor advised. Lin nodded politely, knowing she would do no such thing. 2 weeks of rest would mean arriving at the showcase having barely practiced the third movement. It wasn't an option. Instead, she began icing her wrist between practice sessions and wearing the brace at night. She modified her technique slightly to reduce strain, and took the anti-inflammatory medication religiously. The pain remained, but she learned to play through it, gritting her teeth during the most demanding passages. Wu watched her with concern. "Music isn't worth injuring yourself," he said one morning as he brought her tea. "It's just for 3 more weeks," Lin replied, forcing a smile. "I can rest afterward." Wu shook his head but didn't argue further. Instead, he shared stories of great pianists he had observed over his years at the Conservatory. Their practice habits, their pre-performance rituals, their triumphs and failures. The truly great ones, he told her, found their own voice. They didn't try to sound like anyone else. His words stayed with Lin as she continued to refine her interpretation of the concerto. She had been so focused on playing the notes correctly that she'd sometimes lost sight of the music itself. Now, despite the pain in her wrist, she began to experiment more with phrasing and dynamics, infusing the piece with her own understanding of its emotional landscape. 2 weeks before the showcase, Professor Wang appeared at the door of her practice room. Lin stopped playing mid-phrase, startled by the unexpected visitor. "Mrs. Zhang," Professor Wang said with a tight smile, "I see you're still preparing for the showcase. How dedicated." Lin straightened her back, meeting the professor's gaze. "Yes, I am." Professor Wang entered the room, her eyes taking in the worn score on the piano, the bottle of pain medication beside it, the brace lying on a nearby chair. "Professor Chen mentioned he heard you playing. He seemed to think you might actually go through with this." "I intend to," Lin said simply. Professor Wang's smile didn't reach her eyes. "The showcase is quite important to the conservatory. Many influential people will be attending. Donors, music critics, potential students, and their parents." She paused meaningfully. "We have a certain standard to maintain." Lin understood the implication. "Are you asking me to withdraw?" "I'm merely suggesting that if you don't feel adequately prepared, no one would think less of you for recognizing your limitations." Lin felt a familiar flare of defiance. "Thank you for your concern, Professor Wang, but I'll be playing as scheduled." The professor's smile tightened further. "As you wish. The program has already gone to print." She turned to leave, then added over her shoulder, "Best of luck. Mrs. Zhang, you'll certainly need it." After she left, Lin remained at the piano, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a quiet, burning determination. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play the opening bars of the concerto once more. Each note a declaration. "I belong here too." 1 week before the showcase, Lin's practice room became her entire world. She arrived earlier and stayed later, barely noticing the changing light through the window as day turned to evening. Her wrist pain had become a constant companion, dulled somewhat by medication but never truly absent. She'd learned to adjust her playing to accommodate it, finding new fingerings for particularly troublesome passages. Wu brought her tea as always, but now he also brought small homemade meals when he noticed she wasn't taking breaks to eat. "You won't make it to the showcase if you collapse from hunger," he scolded gently, setting down a container of dumplings one afternoon. Lin smiled gratefully. "Thank you, Wu. I don't know what I would have done without you these past weeks." The old custodian waved away her thanks. "You've brought more real music to this room than I've heard in years. Most students here, they play like machines. Perfect technique, no soul." He tapped his chest. "But you play from here." "Even with all my mistakes?" Lin asked, flexing her sore fingers. "Especially with your mistakes," Wu replied with a wink. "Those show you're human." The audience doesn't remember perfect notes. They remember how the music made them feel. Lin thought about this as she continued to practice that day. She'd been so focused on technical accuracy that she sometimes forgot why she loved music in the first place. How it could express things too complex for words, how it could reach into the heart and awaken forgotten emotions. That evening, instead of drilling difficult passages as planned, Lin played through the entire concerto from beginning to end, without stopping to correct mistakes. She allowed herself to be carried by the music, to feel its emotional arc, the questioning uncertainty of the opening theme, the sweeping romance of the second movement, the triumphant struggle of the finale. When she finished, she was surprised to find tears on her cheeks. For the first time, she had truly heard the story in Rachmaninoff's notes, and recognized echoes of her own story within it. The next day, Lin arrived to find Professor Chen waiting outside her practice room. "Mrs. Zhang," he greeted her with a nod. "May I come in?" Lin's heart raced as she unlocked the door. "Of course, Professor." He followed her inside and got straight to the point. "The showcase is Saturday evening. You'll have a brief rehearsal with the chamber orchestra on Friday afternoon." Lin's eyes widened. "Orchestra? I thought I would be playing solo." "It's a concerto," Professor Chen said with a raised eyebrow. "Normally played with an orchestra. We're using a reduced chamber arrangement. First violin, second violin, viola, cello, bass, and myself conducting from the second piano with the orchestral reduction." Lin felt a wave of panic. She had been practicing the solo part only, never considering she would be playing with other musicians. "I've never played with an orchestra before. I suspected as much." Professor Chen's expression softened slightly. "That's why I'm here. We need to prepare you for the rehearsal." For the next 2 hours he worked with her on orchestral entrances, tempo changes, and the complex relationship between soloist and conductor. He was demanding but not unkind, stopping her frequently to make adjustments. "Here at the recapitulation," he said, pointing to a passage in the first movement, "you must be absolutely precise. The orchestra will follow your lead into the theme." He demonstrated on the piano, his hands confident and controlled. "Try it again." Lin played the passage, focusing on the clarity of the entrance. Professor Chen nodded. "Better. Again." By the end of the session, Lin's head was spinning with new information, but she felt more prepared for the challenge ahead. As Professor Chen gathered his things to leave, he paused. "Mrs. Zhang, I must ask, who has been helping you with this piece? Your interpretation has evolved in ways I wouldn't have expected." Lin hesitated, not wanting to get Wu in trouble. "I've been working mostly on my own." Professor Chen looked skeptical. "The way you're shaping the second movement, that's not something a self-taught pianist would discover." "Well," Lin admitted, "I've had some advice from Wu." "The custodian?" Professor Chen looked genuinely surprised. Lin nodded. "He knows a lot about music. He's been here for 30 years listening to everyone practice." A complex expression crossed Professor Chen's face. Surprise, then thoughtfulness. "I see." He adjusted his glasses. "Well, whoever your influence is, your progress is notable." It wasn't exactly praise, but coming from Professor Chen, it felt significant. The following day brought a new challenge. Lin arrived to find a young woman waiting outside her practice room. Professor Liu, the piano faculty member who had first suggested Rachmaninoff's concerto for her showcase piece. "Mrs. Zhang," Professor Liu greeted her with a cool smile. "I thought I should hear how you're managing with the H3 before the rehearsal tomorrow." Lin unlocked the practice room, her mouth suddenly dry. "Please come in." Professor Liu settled into the room's only chair, her posture perfect, her expression expectant. "Whenever you're ready." Taking a deep breath, Lin began to play. She chose the second movement, which she felt most confident about. As she played, she tried to focus on the music rather than the critical eyes watching her. But she could feel herself becoming increasingly tense under Professor Liu's scrutiny. When she finished, Professor Liu was silent for a moment. "Your technique is different," she said finally. "Self-taught, I presume?" Lin nodded, bracing herself for criticism. "You're taking some unusual liberties with the tempo," Professor Liu continued. "And your dynamics in the development section don't follow the score exactly." "I'm sorry," Lin began. But Professor Liu held up a hand. "I didn't say it was wrong. Mrs. Zhang, just unexpected." She tilted her head thoughtfully. "There's a rawness to your interpretation that's actually quite affecting." Lin wasn't sure how to respond. "Thank you?" A hint of a smile crossed Professor Liu's face. It wasn't exactly a compliment, but it wasn't criticism either. She stood up. "The real test will be tomorrow at the rehearsal. The orchestra won't be as forgiving of timing inconsistencies as a solo performance would be." After she left, Lin sat at the piano, her confidence shaken. She had become comfortable playing alone, finding her own way through the music. But tomorrow she would need to coordinate with 6 other musicians and a conductor. The thought was terrifying. That evening, as Lin prepared to leave, Wu appeared with a small paper bag. "For your wrist," he said, handing it to her. "My wife's special herbal poultice. Better than those pills you've been taking." Lin accepted the bag gratefully. "The rehearsal is tomorrow." Wu nodded. "I know. I've arranged to clean the recital hall during your session. He winked. Just doing my job, of course. Lynn smiled, touched by his thoughtfulness. Of course. At home, Lynn found Zhang waiting with a surprise, a simple black dress laid out on their bed. For the showcase, he said proudly. I thought you might want something special to wear. Lynn touched the soft fabric, emotion welling in her throat. It was nothing fancy by the standards of the Conservatory's elite, but it was the nicest thing she'd owned in years. It's perfect, she whispered, embracing her husband. Thank you. I'm so proud of you, Zhang said, holding her tightly. No matter what happens on Saturday, you've already accomplished something remarkable. Lynn nodded against his shoulder, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. After all these weeks of preparation, the reality of what she had undertaken was finally hitting her. In 2 days, she would perform one of the most difficult piano concertos ever written, in front of an audience of musical experts. The thought was overwhelming. That night, Lynn dreamed of playing in the recital hall, but in her dream, the piano keys kept moving, shifting under her fingers. She woke at 3 a.m, her heart racing, and couldn't fall back asleep. Instead, she got up and practiced silently on the kitchen table, her fingers moving through the most difficult passages of the concerto from memory. Friday dawned gray and rainy. Lynn arrived at the conservatory early, hoping to get in some final practice before the rehearsal, but found the piano faculty in a meeting in her usual room. Instead, she found a quiet corner in the library and studied the score, mentally rehearsing every note. At 2 o'clock, she made her way to the recital hall. Through the doors, she could hear the sound of instruments tuning, the strings adjusting their pitch, creating that distinctive sound of an orchestra preparing to play. Her hands trembled as she pushed the door open. The chamber group was arranged on stage, 5 string players and Professor Chen at the second piano. They all looked up as she entered. "Ah, Mrs. Zhang," Professor Chen said, checking his watch. "Right on time. Please take your place at the piano." Lynn walked onto the stage, acutely aware of the curious eyes following her. The string players were all conservatory faculty, accomplished musicians who had performed with major orchestras around the world. And here she was, a housewife who had been seriously practicing for less than 2 months, about to play with them as a soloist. She sat at the magnificent Steinway, adjusting the bench, trying to calm her racing heart. From his position at the second piano, Professor Chen gave her a nod. "We'll start with the opening of the first movement. Whenever you're ready, Mrs. Zhang." Lynn placed her hands on the keys, took a deep breath, and began to play the concerto's famous opening theme. The notes came out tentatively at first, but as she continued, she found her confidence growing. When the strings entered, their rich sound surrounding her piano line, she felt a thrill unlike anything she had experienced before. Playing with the orchestra was completely different from practicing alone. It was like the difference between singing solo and being part of a choir. Suddenly, her part was one voice in a conversation, responding to and inspiring the voices around her. Of course, there were problems. Lynn got lost during a complex passage in the first movement, forcing Professor Chen to stop the rehearsal. In the third movement, she rushed the tempo, leaving the string players scrambling to keep up. Again, from letter D, Professor Chen would say, his tone firm but not unkind. "Listen for the cello entrance before your next passage." Each time they stopped, Lynn felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. But each time they resumed, she understood the music a little better, felt more connected to the other musicians. In the corner of the hall, Wu was supposedly dusting the back row of seats. But Lynn noticed he had been working on the same area for nearly an hour, listening intently. After a particularly successful run-through of the second movement, the first violinist, an older woman with silver-streaked hair, gave Lynn an encouraging smile. "Beautiful phrasing on the main theme," she said quietly as Professor Chen reorganized his score. By the end of the 3-hour rehearsal, Lynn was exhausted but exhilarated. Despite the rough patches, they had made it through the entire concerto. Professor Chen gave final instructions to the string players, then turned to Lynn. "Tomorrow, 5 o'clock. The showcase begins at 7, but you'll need time to warm up and prepare." His expression was unreadable as ever. "Get some rest, Mrs. Zhang. It's been a productive rehearsal." As the musicians packed up their instruments, Lynn remained at the piano, too overwhelmed to move. She had actually done it. rehearsed Rachmaninoff's Third Concerto with a chamber orchestra. Tomorrow she would perform it in front of an audience. The thought brought a fresh wave of anxiety. What if she failed? What if she froze on stage, forgetting everything she had practiced? What if her wrist pain became unbearable mid-performance? "Stop that," came Wu's voice beside her. He had finished his cleaning and approached the stage. "I can see you worrying from across the room." Lynn managed a small smile. "Is it that obvious?" "Clear as day." Wu sat down on the edge of the stage. "You know, I've seen hundreds of musicians get that same look before a performance. Even the great ones, what did they do about it?" Wu considered this. The ones who performed best? They accepted the fear, welcomed it even, used it to sharpen their focus. He patted her hand. "The music is in you now. Trust it to come out when you need it." Lynn nodded, gathering her score and her courage. One more day, one more challenge. Then, whatever the outcome, she would have answered the question that had driven her all these weeks. Could she do it? Could the simple housewife play one of the most difficult piano concertos ever written? Tomorrow the world would know. The day of the showcase arrived with golden autumn sunshine streaming through the apartment windows. Lynn had barely slept, waking repeatedly from dreams of forgotten notes and missed entrances. She moved through the morning in a daze, trying to eat the breakfast Zhang prepared but finding each bite difficult to swallow. "You should rest today," Zhang said, watching her with concern. "Save your strength for tonight." Lynn nodded absently, but rest seemed impossible. Her mind raced with fragments of music, with all the things that could go wrong, with the faces of professors who had watched her with such skepticism. She tried to lie down, but after 20 minutes of staring at the ceiling, she got up and went to their small electric keyboard. Not to practice. She knew practicing now would only feed her anxiety, but simply to feel the familiar shape of the keys beneath her fingers, to ground herself in the physical reality of the instrument. As afternoon approached, Lynn carefully applied Wu's herbal poultice to her wrist, then wrapped it in the brace. The pain had lessened somewhat over the past days, but she knew the demanding performance ahead would test its limits. She dressed in the black dress Zhang had bought her, its simple elegance a stark contrast to the elaborate gown she imagined the other performers would wear. Zhang helped zip it up, then stepped back to look at her. "Beautiful," he said softly. "Truly beautiful." Lynn smiled nervously. "I don't feel beautiful. I feel terrified." Zhang took her hands in his. "Do you remember when we first met? At your cousin's wedding?" Lynn nodded, surprised by the change of subject. "You were playing piano at the reception, just simple folk songs, nothing fancy. But I couldn't take my eyes off you. It wasn't just that you played well. It was how lost you became in the music, how your whole face lit up." He squeezed her hands gently. "That's what I hope for you tonight. Not perfection, just that joy I saw then." Lynn felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything. For believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." They arrived at the conservatory at 4:45. The building hummed with pre-performance energy. Students and faculty hurrying through hallways. The sound of instruments being tuned drifting from practice rooms. Stage crew checking lighting and sound in the recital hall. Lynn made her way backstage, where a student usher directed her to a small warm-up room. It contained an upright piano and a mirror, presumably for performers to check their appearance before going on stage. Lynn sat at the piano but didn't play immediately. Instead, she closed her eyes and took several deep breaths, trying to center herself the way Wu had taught her. A knock at the door interrupted her meditation. She opened it to find Wu standing there with a small bouquet of wildflowers. "From my garden," he said, handing them to her. "For luck." Lynn accepted them with a grateful smile. "I'm so nervous, Wu. What if I forget everything?" "You won't." His weathered face was serene, confident. "The music is in you now. Your fingers know what to do. But what if it's not good enough? These people..." She gestured vaguely toward the hall where the audience would soon gather. "These people," Wu said gently, "have heard perfect playing many times. Technical brilliance is common here. But true feeling, that's rare." He tapped her chest, just above her heart. "Play from here and you will reach them regardless of any mistakes." Another knock came, and Professor Chen appeared behind Wu. "Mrs. Zhang, 5 minutes until the orchestra warms up." Wu squeezed her shoulder and left, nodding respectfully to Professor Chen as he passed. The professor entered the room, his usual stern expression replaced by something more thoughtful. "How is your wrist?" he asked, noticing the brace she had just removed. "It will manage," Lin replied, flexing her fingers. Professor Chen nodded. "Good. Now remember what we discussed in rehearsal. Follow my cues for tempo changes and don't rush the cadenza." He hesitated, then added, "And Mrs. Zhang, don't be intimidated by the audience. They're just people who love music." Lin was touched by this unexpected encouragement. "Thank you, Professor." He gave a curt nod and checked his watch. "Time to go." Lin followed him through the backstage area to the wings of the recital hall. Through a gap in the curtains, she could see the chamber orchestra taking their places, adjusting their stands, tuning their instruments. Beyond them, the hall was filling with people, conservatory students and faculty, wealthy donors in evening wear, music critics with notebooks at the ready. In the front row, Lin spotted Professor Wang speaking with an elderly man who appeared to be an important patron. Her heart rate quickened as she realized the true scale of the event. This wasn't just a small faculty showcase, it was a significant cultural event for the conservatory. She scanned the audience for Zhang and found him in the third row, looking as nervous as she felt. Beside him was an empty seat, reserved for her after her performance, she realized. The house lights dimmed and the audience quieted. The conservatory director walked onto the stage to welcoming applause. He spoke briefly about the conservatory's history and its upcoming centennial celebration, then introduced the evening's program. "Our showcase tonight features performances by our distinguished faculty, demonstrating the artistic excellence that has defined our institution for nearly 100 years. Lin listened as he listed the performers: a celebrated violinist, a renowned soprano, an award-winning flutist. Each introduction came with an impressive list of accomplishments and accolades. When he reached her name, there was a noticeable pause. "And we have a special guest performer tonight, Mrs. Lin Mei Zhang, who will be playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 in D minor, accompanied by our chamber ensemble under the direction of Professor Chen." That was it. No accomplishments. No accolades, just her name and the piece. Lin felt a flash of embarrassment, followed quickly by determination. By the end of tonight, her playing would speak for itself. The first three performers were flawless as expected. Lin watched from the wings, her anxiety growing with each technically perfect performance. When it was finally her turn, she felt frozen in place until Professor Chen appeared beside her. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Lin nodded, though she felt anything but ready. Still, she followed him onto the stage, blinking in the bright lights. The applause was polite but reserved as she made her way to the piano. She adjusted the bench, wiped her damp palms on her dress, and looked to Professor Chen for his cue. The hall fell silent. Lin placed her hands on the keys and took a deep breath. In that moment of perfect stillness, she thought of all that had brought her here. Her childhood love of music, the years of quiet longing, the weeks of relentless practice, the pain and doubt and determination. And suddenly she knew exactly why she was here, exactly what she wanted to say through Rachmaninoff's notes. She began to play. The famous opening theme emerged, quiet but clear. Lin felt a moment of surreal detachment, as though she were listening to someone else play. Then the orchestra entered, surrounding her with sound, and she was fully present again, fully part of this living, breathing music. As the first movement unfolded, Lin found herself less focused on the technical challenges than on the conversation between her piano and the orchestra, the way the music passed between them like a story being told by many voices. When mistakes came, and they did come, she moved past them without hesitation, keeping her focus on the emotional arc of the piece. The notorious cadenza approached, that virtuosic solo passage that had been her nemesis for weeks. Lin took a breath and plunged in, her fingers finding the notes almost of their own accord. It wasn't perfect. She simplified a few of the most difficult passages, but it flowed with genuine feeling, building to a passionate climax that led perfectly back to the orchestra's entrance. By the second movement, Lin had forgotten the audience entirely. She was playing now for herself, for the music, for the pure joy of bringing these notes to life. The lyrical melody sang beneath her fingers, tender and bittersweet. She thought of her mother's face when they sold the family piano, of the dreams she had set aside, of the strange and unexpected journey that had led her back to music. When the third movement began with its fiery theme, Lynn felt a surge of energy despite her fatigue. This was the home stretch, the final challenge. Her wrist ached fiercely now, but she pushed through the pain, carried by the momentum of the music and the responsive energy of the orchestra around her. The concerto built toward its thunderous conclusion. Piano and orchestra locked in a dance of increasing intensity. Lynn's fingers flew across the keys, finding strength she didn't know she possessed. As she played the final triumphant chords, she felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration, as though she had climbed a mountain and now stood breathless at its peak. The last note rang through the hall, fading slowly into silence. For a moment, the longest moment of Lynn's life, there was no reaction at all. She sat frozen at the piano, suddenly aware again of the audience, of the hundreds of eyes upon her. Had she failed? Had her performance been so inadequate that they didn't even know how to respond? Then it came, first from the back of the hall, then spreading like wildfire through the audience, and applause building quickly to a roar. People were standing, their faces animated with surprise and appreciation. Lynn saw Zhang on his feet, tears streaming down his face as he clapped furiously. Professor Chen extended his hand to her, helping her to her feet for a bow. She was surprised to see genuine respect in his eyes, perhaps even a hint of a smile. The string players tapped their bows against their stands, a musician's special acknowledgement of a soloist. As Lynn took her second bow, she spotted Wu standing at the back of the hall, applauding with unrestrained joy. Beside him, Professor Wang's face was a study in conflicting emotions, shock, disbelief, and something that might almost have been admiration. The applause continued as Lynn left the stage, her legs shaking so badly she could barely walk. In the wings, she leaned against a wall, overwhelmed by what had just happened. Professor Liu appeared beside her, eyes wide with surprise. "Mrs. Zhang," she said, shaking her head in wonder. That was remarkable. Not technically perfect, certainly, but so alive, so honest. Before Lynn could respond, she was surrounded by other faculty members, then by students asking questions about her interpretation, her background, her approach to the piece. It was surreal. These accomplished musicians treating her as a peer, seeking her insights rather than offering criticism. Eventually, she made her way to her seat beside Zhang, who embraced her tightly. "I've never been so proud," he whispered. "You were magnificent." The remainder of the showcase passed in a blur. Lynn could hardly focus on the other performances, still processing what had happened, still feeling the music coursing through her body. At the reception afterward, she found herself the center of attention. The elderly patron she had seen with Professor Wang approached her, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "My dear," he said, taking her hand, "yours was the only performance tonight that brought me to tears. Tell me, where did you study?" Before Lynn could answer, Professor Wang appeared at his side. "Mrs. Zhang has a rather unconventional background," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "In fact, until recently she hadn't played seriously since childhood." The patron looked astonished. "Is this true?" Lynn nodded. "Yes, I've only been practicing this piece for 8 weeks. "Extraordinary," the man exclaimed. "In that case, I'd like to discuss something with you and the director. I've been considering funding a new scholarship program for the Conservatory, and I believe I've just found my inspiration." As he led her away toward the director, Lynn caught Professor Wang's expression, a complex mixture of surprise and reluctant respect. Something had shifted tonight, not just for Lynn, but perhaps for the conservatory itself. Later, as she and Zhang prepared to leave, Wu appeared with her coat. "I told you," he said with a wink. "It's not about playing every note perfectly. It's about making people feel something." Lynn hugged him impulsively. "Thank you, Wu, for everything." He patted her back. "No, thank you, for reminding us all what music is really about." As they walked home through the cool autumn night, Lynn's fingers still tingled with the memory of the keys beneath them. Her wrist throbbed, her back ached, and exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders. But her heart was lighter than it had been in years. "What will you do now?" Zhang asked softly. "After tonight, you could probably study here if you wanted." Professor Chen actually seemed impressed. Lynn considered this as they walked beneath the streetlights. The thought was tempting, to reclaim the path she had abandoned so many years ago, to become the pianist she might have been. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But whatever happens next, I'll never let go of music again." She looked up at the stars, thinking of the journey that had brought her here, From a dismissee,